Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Arctic disasters. New theories on two ill-fated expeditions. Presented by NatHab expedition leader Anthony Mallinson. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all for being here with us today. Take it away, Anthony.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that great introduction as always, Rob. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today at the Daily Dose of Nature. Like Rob said, my name is Anthony, and I am one of the Canadian expedition leaders here with NatHab, mostly working out of Churchill. So I run trips during the polar bear season, and I'll be up there in a couple weeks to start off the Northern Lights season, as well as running some of our new itineraries over in Newfoundland. So I have a background in environmental science and geology, and I'm talking today from southern British Columbia, my little home, a little ski resort town in Rossland, British Columbia, the traditional territory of the Sinix people, and a really great ski resort. So if you're a skier, you might have heard of Red Mountain. We're getting one of those really beautiful blasts of cold Arctic air right now, so it's exciting to be talking to you about some Arctic disasters. And we're going to hopefully discover and chat about what really happened to two different expeditions, that of Jens Munk and Sir John Franklin. And between these two expeditions, 191 lives were lost. And you might be wondering what these expeditions have to do with Churchill and what they have to do perhaps with polar bears. And it's actually quite a lot. So I'm excited to dive into these two stories with you today. So we'll have a quick look at how the presentation will go for this afternoon. First, I want to talk very quickly about the first people that we know in the Canadian Arctic and kind of that peopling of the Arctic. We don't have enough time to do that justice. That's a couple presentations on its own, so we'll just dive very quickly into that. And then we'll move on to talking about the arrival of the Europeans in the Arctic. And then we'll dive into those two expeditions. So that 1619 Jens Munk expedition, the first expedition to reach Churchill, and that 1845 John Franklin expedition in the Northwest Passage. And then we'll talk about a little bit how the Northwest Passage is changing today. And like Rob said, we will leave some time for questions. So we'll dive right into it. We'll have a quick look at the beginning of human history in the Arctic. So the first evidence of people in the Arctic that we know dates to about 3,500 years ago. In Churchill region, that's about 2,500 years ago. If you've had the opportunity to join us on one of our trips, or if you come join us in the next couple of years, we often go out to a site called Cape Mary, and you can see some of those archaeological dig sites out at Cape Mary where they found some of that early evidence of people. So we call these early cultures the Independence 1 and Independence 2 cultures, and they mostly inhabited the northern part of Canada and into the northern part of Greenland as well. These cultures are quite poorly documented. We don't know much about their origin or how and why they disappeared, but we do know that they were a hunter-gatherer people that relied on much more inland resources than we see the Inuit relying on today. These cultures seem to have flourished about 500 BC, and that's when the Dorset started to cross from the Siberia area across the Bering Land Bridge to populate the Canadian Arctic and Greenland as well. And funnily enough, the origins of the Dorset people are also not well understood. So what's the confusion? Well, similar to the polar bear fossil record, it can be really hard to find evidence of things up in the north. It's a vast, wild area that's incredibly hard to do research. And most of the signs of these cultures have returned to Earth as the building materials or natural materials as well. And there's just a lot of wilderness up in the Arctic. It's thought, obviously, that perhaps these cultures developed from previous cultures of pre-Dorset origin. However, there's a little bit of problems with this theory. We lose the bow and arrow technology. It's kind of lost and regained, and we're missing some of that drill technology in the Dorset culture as well, whereas both the pre-Dorset and the Thule Inuit who came after the Dorset had that drill technology. So there's a little bit of confusion, the origin of these people and actually what ultimately led to their demise. The Dorset culture seems to have lasted from about 500 BCE to as late as about 1500 CE. And we can see a beautiful example of some of that, the Dorset artwork here, these Dorset masks and some of these Dorset figures. And again, if you come up to Churchill where we do some of our programming, we often get the opportunity to visit the Atsanatech Museum. And the Atsanatech Museum has a wonderful collection of these Dorset artifacts. So like I said, we won't spend too much time on the early people of the Arctic, but we will start to talk about the Thule and the Inuit cultures as well. So beginning around the year 1000, Thule invaders appear to have wiped out the Dorset people in what historians have called an example of prehistoric genocide. So Thule legends recount them encountering a people called the Tunit people, And according to legends, these first inhabitants were giants. They were taller and stronger than the Thule, but they were afraid to interact and easily put to flight. So the Thule Inuit are the ancestors of all modern Inuit, who are the indigenous people that are spread across the Arctic of Canada, Greenland, and over into Alaska. This Thule and Inuit culture developed in coastal Alaska by the year 1000 and expanded across northern Canada, reaching Greenland by about the 1200s. And the Thule and Inuit relied on much different hunting strategies and relied on much different prey species than the Dorset, whom they replaced from earlier. So you can see an example of advances in technology. So the Thule and the Inuit relied on dog teams. You can see an Inuit dog team there. And the image below shows a kayak, which is the enclosed boat, and an umiak, which is a much larger vessel used to transport people and goods. And taking advantage of these new technologies allowed the Thule and Inuit to follow animal movement. So they were able to exploit marine mammals and had a lot of success in hunting bowhead whales in particular. So kayaks and those umiaks, and then ranging a lot further in the dog sleds. So you can see an example of an early Thule home constructed with those massive bowhead whale bones. And in some prime whaling areas, the Thule sites regularly could contain 15 to 20 homes, and in one case, up to 60 homes. So these incredibly well-adapted culture, and these people are incredibly well-adapted to a way of life in the north, which is quite opposed to the Europeans. So we first see the arrival of the Europeans actually quite early. One of the first Europeans we see to arrive in the north is a man named Pytheas, and it's thought that he actually traveled up to the Arctic in the year 325 BCE. He reached a land that he called Thule, which is about 6 days sail north from Britain and extending up into the Arctic Circle. But we'll jump ahead a little bit. We're going to talk about Europeans arriving in North America, not just the Arctic. And we often think of Christopher Columbus when we think of the first European to reach North America. It's what we learned in grade school. But now more recent evidence has suggested that it was actually the Vikings. So one of my great ancestors, Leif Erikson, was the first to reach North America. It's thought that he overwintered with a crew of about 35 men on the northern tip of Newfoundland and returned to Greenland the following year. It wasn't until about 1010 that we see another Norseman sailing over with about 200 settlers and livestock and attempting the first European settlement in the New World at L'Anse aux Meadows. So the settlement's quite short-lived. It appears maybe some internal dissent and conflict with local indigenous groups caused this group to return back over to Greenland. And it's until about 1450 that there are kind of routine visits for lumber and fur by the Norse and the Vikings over on the North American the North American mainland. It's not until about 1450 when the Vikings actually abandoned Greenland that they abandoned those visits over to the North American continent. There's also some new evidence. I just included that photo there on the bottom right, a site up on southwestern Baffin Island that hasn't had any research done since 2012, but there's a lot of evidence there that suggests that there might have been a Viking settlement there as well. There's building remains, there's a stone crucible containing bronze from Europe, there's one tally sticks, there's 2 whetstones typical of Norse ironwork. So it's quite amazing to think the extent that the Vikings were actually traveling into the North American area. After the Vikings, so kind of abandoning the area around 1450, there's really not too much time that passes until we see the arrival of more early Europeans. So according to another historian, Robert McGee, the value of whale oil and salt cod exported during the 16th century from what is now Atlantic Canada was the equivalent to the value of precious metals extracted by the Spanish from Mexico and Peru during the same time period. So a massive amount of value is being taken out of the North Atlantic fishery. And it's thought that the Basque, the Portuguese, and eventually the British were actually visiting the banks off of Newfoundland and fishing long before Columbus had actually traveled over there. So they were searching for new fishing grounds that would have been free of some of the monopolies that had already been established over in Europe. And I don't know if we have any fishermen or fisherwomen watching the webinar now, or I'm sure you have friends that are fishers. They don't typically tell you those really great fishing spots. They like to keep it a secret. So there is some evidence now in the form of letters that they were over there fishing in North America, but they were keeping those areas secret for commercial interests. So it's also around this time that we see the search for the Northwest Passage beginning. Why exactly were we looking for a Northwest Passage in the first place? Well, it would allow the British in particular to avoid the Portuguese and Spanish controlled waters and allow an easier and shorter route from Europe over to the Orient where they were trading. So the earliest European that we see really starting to search for this Northwest Passage, at least up in the Canadian Arctic, is Martin Frobisher. So he's that fancy looking gentleman there on the left. And this is in 1576. He's the first European to explore the Canadian Arctic and the first to enter what eventually becomes known as Hudson Strait, that narrow body of water that connects to Hudson Bay. He led 3 expeditions. His final one in 1578 still holds the record as being the largest polar expedition ever launched with 15 ships. Frobisher is also the first attempt by England to establish a settlement in the New World, and he'll go down in history as the first major gold mining fraud in North America. As he was really quite excited, he thought he'd found a beautiful deposit of gold, and he ended up bringing back a lot of fool's gold or pyrite and was ridiculed quite heavily for his mistake. So we could spend a long time talking about different Arctic explorers. We'll jump ahead a little bit in time, and we'll discuss Henry Hudson. So no discussion of history, especially here at NatHab, would be complete without talking about Henry Hudson, especially just due to our connection in Churchill. So 1610, Henry Hudson is sailing for the Northwest Passage. By this time, he'd already done a bit of exploring. He'd explored the Hudson River. So if you're from the East Coast there, you might be familiar with Henry Hudson Parkway, Hudson River, named after the gentleman, or the same gentleman, my apologies. So in 1610, he was searching for the Northwest Passage. British merchants were really urging someone to find a way through that furious overfall that Frobisher had reported at Hudson Strait. So Henry Hudson is sailing aboard the Discovery with 21 men. And upon passing through that strait and heading south down the east coast of Hudson Bay, they begin to get very excited. They think that maybe they've pushed through the vast majority of the Northwest Passage. They're heading south to warmer waters. But it's not until later in the year they start trending north again, and their boat actually gets stuck in ice at the southern part of the bay. So they're forced to overwinter. And Hudson really wants to continue the following spring. He believes himself quite close to discovering that fabled passage. But apparently, according to some of those early journals we have of the men, Hudson wasn't the best leader. He was quick to demote and promote seemingly at random. He was prone to violent outbursts, and many of his men suspected him of holding food. And after the mutiny, when they break into his quarters, he was indeed hoarding hundreds of pounds of food for himself and his young son. So his men decide to mutiny. They leave Henry Hudson, his son John, and 7 crewmen on a small shallop in the middle of Hudson Bay. The crew and the Discovery make back for England. Unfortunately, karma is no longer on their side. On the return journey, 1 man dies of starvation and 4 men are killed by the Inuit. But what of Henry Hudson? So him, his young son, and 7 men are aboard the small shallop, and none of them are ever seen again. So it's thought that it's thought that they perished there in the small shallop in the frigid waters of Hudson Bay. But everyone loves a historical mystery. And in 1959, when some workers were excavating an area in the Ottawa River Valley to build a new highway, they discovered a rock here. So I've included a photo of it there. The rock bears the inscriptions HH 1612 captive. And there's actually 3 rocks that have been found in the Ottawa River Valley. And it's thought, or it's a fun thought, that perhaps Henry Hudson and those men were able to sail that small boat back to shore and begin heading south using the river system, trying to get to the St. Lawrence River system, where they knew that Champlain and some other early settlers had already started settling up settlements. So perhaps his fate was not actually freezing to death on Hudson Bay. So we arrive now at our first of the ill-fated expeditions that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, and that is the expedition of Jens Munk in 1619. So this is easily the second greatest disaster in the history of Arctic exploration, and really one of the most revealing. By the time Jens Munk would leave Churchill, only 3 of the original 65 men that he left Europe with would be alive. We'll back up a bit. We'll start at the beginning. So Jens Munk left to discover that fabled Northwest Passage in 1619. He already had some experience in exploration, and he was using those Henry Hudson charts to sneak across Hudson Bay. So he landed at the mouth of the Churchill River. He was the first European to reach the mouth of the Churchill River, and he named it Nova Denia, or New Denmark. So we can see a beautiful image from the expedition there. If you've been to Churchill, you might recognize that peninsula of land. The town of Churchill is over on the right-hand side. The boats are pulled up in an area that we now know of as Sloops Cove. So if you get a chance to come up on any of our Churchill summer programs, sometimes we head back to that Sloops Cove area. So Jens Monk decides it's time to overwinter. They pull the boats up and they secure the boats on the banks of the Churchill River. By October 4th, Jens Monk is already distributing amongst the crew all the clothing, shirts, shoes, and boots available in the ship's stores, and it's still not enough. It's also around this time, just before snow is beginning to cover the ground, that Jens Monk becomes aware that the First Nations groups appear to have had some summer camps in the area but already abandoned the site. By October 22nd, the boats are completely iced in. So if you were visiting with us this past polar bear season, you might have noticed that we still had open water by the time that we left in the end of November. So things have changed a little bit in the time that it's been since Jens Monk visited. It's also around this time that his diary begins to reveal quite hectic activity. The lamprey and the unicorn, the two boats, are completely stuck in the ice. And when they would have arrived, game would have probably been still quite abundant. There would have been berries left over. There would have been birds migrating south. There would have been caribou moving through the area, and there would have been lots of polar bears. Things quickly begin to change, and rations are reduced. They're really not prepared to overwinter like subsequent expeditions would be. There's not much food available, so they shoot and kill as many polar bears as they can to prepare for the winter. They boil that bear meat, and they distribute that meat amongst the men. Living conditions continue to deteriorate, and they're forced to give up hunting completely due to the frost and snow. From New Year's, Monk's diary is primarily used for recording the dead. Starting on February 20th, 1620, a number of notations occur at regular intervals. 21 corpses. 5 days later, 22 corpses. March 9th appears, 26 corpses. April 1st, 34 dead. May 19th, 57 dead. Finally, on June 4th, 61 dead. This date also bears the testament Monk planned to leave the world. He writes, "Since I no longer have any hopes of living, I can only pray to God that we may be found by some good Christians, and that for God's sake they will cause my poor corpse together with the others to be buried in the earth, receiving the reward from God in heaven." But by June 20th, Monk is miraculously still alive. He emerges from the boat to see two other survivors on shore. Together he joins them, and they suck on roots, fresh shoots, and slowly regain a little bit of strength, which allows them to shoot some birds and other game that's moving through the area. Together, the three of them manage to sail the vessel, which should take about a crew of a minimum of about 15 all the way back to Denmark. And they arrive there with really no fanfare at all. Monk is actually imprisoned for losing a boat and losing so many men, and actually ordered to return back to Churchill, which you can imagine would be quite traumatic. Ultimately, he ends up avoiding this fate. But Churchill really becomes a place of legend to the Inuit and the Cree. You can imagine when they arrive the following summer, there's 62 strange corpses and a pile of gunpowder and supplies. An explosion actually kills many of the Inuit when they ignite that pile of gunpowder. So the Cree actually know the river now as Mantasipi, or River of Strangers, while the Inuit refer to Churchill as the place of iron. But 62 of 65 men is a lot of men. Was it only starvation and exposure that killed everyone? Monk records the symptoms, and many of them do not match with the known symptoms of scurvy, which, although poorly understood at the time, was at least documented. The fate of Jens Monk's men has been debated for decades, and it's only recently thought that perhaps the same fate could have befallen the men of Franklin's expedition. So we'll move ahead. We do want to talk about that Franklin expedition. We'll jump through time again, but quite a lot happened between 1619 and 1845. We could spend a whole other couple of presentations on that, but we'll fill you in briefly. In 1670, the Hudson Bay Company is established. So this is the oldest company in North America. It's about 355 years old now. And they established a series of forts across the Canadian Arctic and across the north. So if you've come up north, if you've been on one of our expeditions, you might have heard your expedition leader talking about how animals in the north are typically larger than their southern counterparts. So they're larger body size, thicker coats, and as a result, the coats and the furs would have a lot more value in the north. So Hudson Bay Company really established a network of trading posts across the northern part of the continent. They would use the river systems as highways to reach deep into the interior, and as a result, You can see on the map here, Churchill became one of those kind of hubs. So Churchill in an area on the Nelson River just further south called York Factory. And following these river systems, you could reach all the way over into Alberta. So if you've had the chance to go through Banff, those same rivers that are flowing through Banff are the rivers that reach Hudson Bay as well. You could also travel down to Winnipeg, where we meet you for our Churchill adventures. And then from Winnipeg, you could hop down and even end up in the Mississippi River system. So you could reach a vast amount of areas using these river systems as highways. We also see the end of the Napoleonic War during this time. So a long 16-year war ending in June of 1850, and this leads to a relative time of peacetime in Europe and comparative idleness for the Royal Navy. So from 1814 to 1870, the Royal Navy shrinks from 145,000 men to just 19,000 men. And it allows the opportunity for the adventurous and better qualified to use Britain's naval superiority to pursue new goals. So namely to extend man's geographical and scientific knowledge by exploration and discovery. So beginning in 1818, Sir John Barrow offers a reward of up to £20,000. So £20,000 in 1818 is about $1 million in today's value. And he offers that reward for the first person to discover the Northwest Passage. This is the first time that we really see John Franklin entering the scene, and we see his first expedition happening in the North. So in 1818, he travels north. He's looking for the North Pole. He's quite unsuccessful. He makes it quite a good ways, one of the furthest north at the time, and this really wets his whistle for exploration. And we can see on the map there a whole lot of exploration is happening in that Hudson Strait area. So some of those early expeditions that were cutting across the Churchill, Jens Monk, but subsequent expeditions charted most of that shoreline. And a lot is true with the rest of the Canadian Arctic. By 1845, a large majority of the Arctic is actually charted when Franklin starts his final expedition. So Franklin's second expedition actually leaves from Churchill. So like we said, Hudson Bay Company established a lot of those forts. It was a really great place to resupply. So men and expeditions would stop at these trading posts and continue on from there. So John Franklin begins his second expedition from Churchill, actually travels overland and using the river systems to reach an area called Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. And then from there continues north to the Arctic coast to a community called Kugluktuk or Coppermine. If you've had the opportunity to do a Northwest Passage cruise, some of those cruises end in Coppermine, or if you're a little bit more adventurous and you can paddle the Coppermine River. Anyway, that's where John Franklin's second expedition ended. And it really wasn't a successful expedition as well. 11 of his 20 men were lost on the expedition, and he gained the wonderful nickname, the man who ate his boots, because his men were starved so much that they actually had to rely on boiling their own leather boots and eating lichen to survive. This is also the first Franklin expedition where we hear whispers of cannibalism, which would become a common theme in some of his other expeditions. His third expedition, much more successful. He mapped about 1,000 kilometers of the coast with his partner Richardson and traveled down the Mackenzie River, being the second European to do so, which is that northward flowing river that reaches the Canadian Arctic from that Yellowknife area. So his fourth expedition is the one that we'll focus on. This would be his last and his most infamous. And unfortunately, after 3 other expeditions, he appears to not have learned very much from the Inuit or the Indigenous people of Canada. So 1845, Secretary Barrow is proposing a final expedition. Barrow's 82 years old at this time, and he really wants to see a completion of the Northwest Passage. So he says the discovery, or rather the completion of a discovery of a passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific around the northern coast of North America ought not to be abandoned after so much has been done and so little now remains to be done. So at this point, Franklin is 59 years old. He's not the first choice for the expedition. He does have some experience, but a lot of his other expeditions haven't ended that well. What he does have though is the backing of his very powerful wife, Lady Franklin, will play a very significant role in subsequent Arctic exploration following this expedition. So while the choice of commander perhaps was in question, the choice of the vessels was never really in question. These would be 2 British bomb ships that had proven themselves for decades in polar expeditions before, the Erebus and the Terror. They'd earned a formidable reputation as the toughest, most dependable ice-resistant ships in the in the British Navy. And these would have been the same vessels that would have been used in the Revolutionary War that are sung about in the US national anthem. So this expedition was thought to be the best equipped voyage of its kind. It had provisions for 3 years, a heating system that used pipes to keep the 134 men warm, a steam engine powering propellers to keep them moving, an enormous library to entertain them and keep them occupied through those winters they'd be iced in, and of course, a dining room lined with porcelain, crystal, and silverware to keep them civilized. By now, by 1845, there's really only about 500 kilometers of that Arctic coastline that's unknown to Europeans. The rest of it has been charted out by explorers, by fur traders, by whalers over the past couple hundred years. The expedition leaves in May 1845, and luckily for these 5 men, they end up dropping 5 men in Greenland due to sickness. These would be the only 5 men that would survive the expedition. So the expedition continues past Baffin Island and reaches a small little island called Beechey Island. Again, if you've been up on Northwest Passage expedition or some Canadian Arctic expeditions, like with our parent company Lindblad, you might have had the opportunity to stop at Beechey Island. It's a really beautiful spot, and there's 4 gravestones there. And there's 3 of those are actually from the Franklin expedition. The 4th is from one of the searchers, the subsequent searchers who was searching for the Franklin expedition. But we see the first 3 men of the expedition die here. So Petty Officer John Torrington, Marine Private William Brain, and able seaman John Hartnell all die in 1845 on Beechey Island. After this, the expedition continues south through areas that are already previously charted to the tip of an island called King William Island. At the time, it was thought to be a peninsula. And by September of 1846, both boats are completely stuck in the ice off of King William Island. One of the only written documents from the expedition is found years later by search parties and is dated from May of 1847. And we call this the Victory Point Cairn. So it was found in a cairn or a large pile of rocks on Victory Point, which is on King William Island. And amongst other things, the note states that all is well. So a couple of men have died over the winters, nothing out of the ordinary. The vessels are stuck, but that was fully expected. They still have provisions. All is well, and the expedition is continuing as expected. However, in April 1848, the note is removed from the cairn and it is amended. The ships are being abandoned. They've been stuck for 2 full years, and all is not well. Sir John Franklin died on June 11, 1847, just weeks after the first note was deposited. His body has still never been found. So the 2 ships were stuck in an area that was quite an area of low productivity, an area that the Inuit didn't typically visit. So in the 2 years that the vessels were stuck there, we don't have any evidence that the Inuit actually encountered them at that spot. They were stuck in an area that the Inuit called Tununik, which translates to the back beyond. This would have been an area with a lot of multi-year ice, so very, very thick ice that doesn't allow sunlight to penetrate through. It doesn't allow the growth of ice algae, the basis of that entire ecosystem, and it really keeps it as a low productivity area. So as the men leave the ships, they actually amend the Victory Point note again in April 1848 to say they're abandoning the boats. By this point, 29 men have died, including Sir John Franklin, and the remaining 105 men appear to be heading south, trying to reach an area on the Canadian mainland. But it's a little bit confusing. This is the best equipped expedition ever sent north. They have provisions for 3 years. They were fully expecting to be stuck in the ice for this amount of time, and somehow they've lost 25% of their men. So something doesn't appear right. Why are all these men dropping dead? Why did Franklin die? So what exactly happened? So older theories that were put forward hold that their deaths were actually perhaps due to lead poisoning. Those 3 bodies from Beechey Island were perfectly preserved in the permafrost, and in the 1980s they were exhumed and they were analyzed for their lead content. And it was actually found that the lead content was quite high. So it's thought that the lead solder, which was used for sealing those 8,000 different canned provisions, was actually slowly seeping into the food and poisoning the men. However, since then, there's been a lot of debate whether the levels of lead were in fact that much higher than the typical levels of lead found in other Europeans at the time. And now some historians believe that the true cause could simply be respiratory illnesses common in the north, such as pneumonia or tuberculosis. We still don't know what actually happened, and we'll never fully know, but we do have a much better idea, as over the past 170 years, amateurs and professionals have pieced together a story. The classic story goes that the men overwintered until April of 1948, so those 2 winters stuck in the ice, then abandoned the vessels and died making their way south. If we reanalyze some of that old Inuit testimony that was collected and some of the scattered evidence that's since disappeared, it suggests that perhaps it was a lot more chaotic than this. So Inuit observations and oral histories talk of seeing men reboarding the vessels and sailing them south as late as 1850 or 1851. So a full 6 years after the initial voyage left for the Arctic. Other men seem to have continued on foot, heading south. Some backtrack and moved around, but ultimately all 129 men died. So these men would have died of starvation, exhaustion, hypothermia, perhaps other factors from being exposed to the elements for 5 years, but it still doesn't explain that extremely high early death rate where 25% of the men had died before they even abandoned the vessels. There's also a lot of oddities discovered among the men who did abandon the vessels, and it's left a lot more questions than answers. And it seems that the men were plagued by some evil beyond malnutrition and exposure. For example, the image here is the Victory Point cairn, so that's one of the written documents. The only other written document that was ever found of the expedition is something we call the Pelgar Papers. It was a journal by one of the seamen, and it was written entirely backwards. Another oddity includes finding what we refer to as a hospital tent with remains of up to about 20 bodies, as if some sickness swept through the camp. And the men appear to be hauling upwards of 200 pounds of really quite useless items. So some books, some china, and then to keep them civilized, they were carrying all that silverware with them as well. There are also incorrect dates in the Victory Point cairn as well, and really quite strange that Franklin and none of the other officers chose to leave any written record at the Beechey Island site. So it appears as though the mental fortitude of the men has already begun to deteriorate before they abandoned the boats. Perhaps, as other Arctic expeditions had done, the men merely fell into dissent and chaos, but perhaps something else was at foot. So subsequent expeditions searching for that Franklin expedition end up mapping out a lot of the Canadian Arctic. There were more than 40 expeditions sent in search of John Franklin, many of them privately funded by Lady Jane and her powerful group of friends. Almost the entirety of the Canadian Arctic was mapped out as a result, and slowly evidence of the Franklin expedition begins to trickle in. John Rae, who's a Scottish explorer famed really for his feats of endurance and adapting his lifestyle to that of the Inuit way of life, was the first to suggest that cannibalism played a major part in the expedition after traveling with the Inuit and finding evidence of cut and cooked bones. He is also the first European that claims to discover the Northwest Passage, as he's the first European to notice that King William Island is in fact an island and not a peninsula, and that's the final kind of piece of the puzzle for the Northwest Passage, so he claims the 10,000 pound reward. Meanwhile, though, in Europe, he's over in North America, his private report of cannibalism to the Admiralty is made public, and Lady Jane uses her friend Charles Dickens to slander John Rae in the press, ruining his reputation. So he is the only notable explorer at the time to not receive knighthood, despite his accomplishments. So after about 170 years of searching, the Erebus and the Terror are finally located by Parks Canada in 2014 and 2016. Ironically, the Terror is found just on the southern coast of King William Island in a bay that had previously been named Terror Bay, and the Erebus is found quite a ways further south off the Canadian mainland in an area that the Inuit had claimed it would be through oral testimony. So what do these two expeditions have in common aside from being very disastrous? Well, we know from extensive journals kept on these expeditions that early explorers were fond of eating polar bear meat and bear meat in general. Particularly, polar bear is readily available throughout the Arctic. In areas where you might not find other animals or game, there would often be bears roaming through. So we know that Jens Monk killed and ate polar bears when they first reached Churchill, and that they lightly boiled this meat and distributed it to all the men. While we don't have any written records from the 1845 John Franklin expedition, we do have records from his earlier expeditions. And we know that he was quite fond of eating bears. So he ate black bear, he ate grizzly bear, and he ate polar bear meat. And then we also know that the boats were stuck in an area of very low productivity, and it would have been likely that the most abundant food source was perhaps polar bears wandering through that area. So today, bear meat can still contain a disease known as trichinosis. I'm going to play this little video. So cover your eyes if you're squeamish. It'll show the little trichinosis worms. So trichinosis is a foodborne disease caused by a microscopic parasite called trichinella. And in Arctic bears, this species is Trichinella nativa. People can get this disease by eating raw or undercooked meat from animals that are infected with the parasite. And today that's often wild boar, rodents, or in particular bears. As a side note, the US has effectively eradicated trichinosis from pork, which is interesting. So these symptoms include symptoms that are very similar to scurvy. So according to the CDC, these symptoms include diarrhea, abdominal pain, vomiting, swelling of the face and eyes, fever, hemorrhaging, rashes, and more. And occasional life-threatening manifestations include myocarditis, central nervous system involvement, and pneumonias, as well as serious neurological deficits. And eventually death can occur about 4 to 6 weeks after an infection. So still, there are deaths every year in North America, particularly from eating black bear meat. Just last year, there was a 10-person trichinosis outbreak, I believe, in Kentucky. So it's still quite a common, not super common, but still something that happens every year here in North America is people getting sick or dying from trichinosis. So for years now, this has been suggested as the cause of death for most of Jens Munck's men. It has been known that when they first arrived in Churchill, they shot those bears, and they even make note of lightly boiling the meat. And it's thought they didn't cook that meat well enough to actually kill off the parasite. And most of the men slowly succumbed to a trichinosis. It's only really been the past couple of years that this has also been suggested to have had an impact on the Franklin expedition. So Canadian historian Ken McCougan, who we've already mentioned, has suggested that during that Franklin expedition, particularly like we talked about during that time when the vessels were stuck in that area of low productivity, the only food source aside from canned provisions to supplement with might have been polar bears that were wandering through, and consuming that undercooked polar bear meat in combination with obviously other factors like exposure led to the mental and physical decline of the men and the larger than expected number of deaths earlier on in the expedition. While it's likely men on both expeditions died from many causes, it's true that other expeditions frequently ate bear meat. It seems likely that trichinosis from undercooked polar bear meat played a significant role in the number of early fatalities and decision-making processes of both parties. So the Northwest Passage is finally completed. It's about 325 years after Martin Frobisher first travels to the Arctic that Roald Amundsen completes the Northwest Passage. So he's this stoic-looking gentleman here. He's a Norwegian explorer, famous for reaching the South Pole, famous for flying a dirigible to the North Pole, famous for completing the Northeast Passage as well. And he becomes the first European to complete the Northwest Passage. As I talked about before, there are other claims. So John Ray does have that claim to be the first to discover the Northwest Passage. But really, it's Roald Amundsen who's the first to sail through on his own vessel from the Atlantic over to the Pacific, taking him about 3 years. Interesting, though, in 1854, McClure, who was searching for that Franklin expedition in a boat called the Investigator, also has a claim of being the first European to transit the Northwest Passage. The Investigator is stuck in ice and destroyed, and McClure is eventually rescued by a gentleman named McClintock in a boat called the Resolute. The Resolute as well is stuck in ice, and they're eventually make it out after 5 years. So McClure claims to be the first European to pass from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Interestingly, that boat, the Resolute, gets stuck in ice as well and floats around for a number of years until a couple of American whaling boats end up bringing it back down to the States. There it is returned, and as a gift, the boat is broken down and turned into 3 desks. And one of those desks is currently sitting in the Oval Office and has been used by a lot of the standing presidents, the Resolute desk. The Northwest Passage today is changing quite quickly. So what took Roald Amundsen 3 years and McClure 5 years now takes about a week if you're in a commercial vessel and you're there at the right time of year. So what was once ice is often now sea. So 2023 even holds the first human-powered crossing of the Northwest Passage in a kayak. And a friend of mine is actually attempting to stand-up paddleboard the entire route just next year. He's about halfway through. So reduced sea ice also means that there's increased shipping, and the Northwest Passage has really become a viable shipping route. There's less clouds, there's more sun, there's less ice, and there's warmer temperatures, and all these feedback on each other. And it means that the Arctic is warming about 4 times faster than other parts of the world. So on November 28th, 2008, the Canadian Coast Guard confirmed the first commercial ship sailing through the Northwest Passage. Parts of the passage are only about 15 meters deep, so it's still quite difficult to navigate. But for example, in September 2013, the Nordic Orion, a 73,000-ton vessel, was able to navigate the passage, and it was sat fully laden. It sat actually too deep to sail through the Panama Canal. So this really shows the Northwest Passage is becoming a viable shipping route. If you look at the imagery here, you can see the increase in vessels and the predicted increase in vessels in both what we call the Northern Sea Route, which is that route above Russia, and the Northwest Passage as well. And we can expect this to just continue into the future. So despite really historical precedent regarding archipelago baselines, the US official position is we view Canada's claim that the waters of the Northwest Passage are internal waters of Canada as inconsistent with international law. The Canadian government maintains that the Northwest Passages are a part of Canadian internal waters, but the US claims they are an international strait and transit passage, allowing free and unencumbered passage. So regardless, these contested sovereignty claims over the waters will complicate future shipping throughout the region and make it particularly interesting to watch in the coming decades. Also, always interesting to note is to look at how this affects the wildlife, and obviously climate change and warming the Arctic is a whole discussion on its own, but it's interesting to see as the Northwest Passage begins to open up, we also see animals beginning to take advantage of this. So we see walrus that are thousands of kilometers outside of the range as they're beginning to move through some of these ice-free waters. And we see species like the gray whale, which has been absent in Atlantic waters since the days of whaling, beginning to return. And it's thought that they're traveling through kind of more ice-free waters in the Northwest Passage. So I want to end the presentation with a personal image from the Arctic. So on the left there, my wife and I have done some paddling in the Northwest Passage as it continues to be more and more ice-free. We spent a couple summers up there. And I also wanted to include an image just with some guests from the past season I did up here in Churchill. So that was during polar bear season. You can see all that open water. And that was one of the later trips of the season as well. So I'm quite privileged to get to work up in the Arctic, to spend time up here for my personal adventures. And I really love getting to share these stories and some of these mysteries about this place with you guys. So hopefully you found something today that really piques your interest in human history in the Arctic and gives you another excuse to come visit us up here in Churchill in any of our 3 seasons we have. So in the polar bear season, or in a couple of weeks for Northern Lights, or in the summer for belugas. And the Arctic's really a beautiful and unique place, and it has challenges that are really quite special that we don't see in other parts of the world. So this could be talking about things like the warming rate that we just discussed, how it's so much more greater in the Arctic, or it could be as wild as what we talked about today, which is 2 Arctic expeditions ultimately perhaps meeting their fate due to eating polar bear meat. And like I said, while this is a new theory, there's really a community of scholars deeply committed to uncovering what happened to the Franklin expedition. I have some friends that spent the last 2 summers searching for Franklin's gravesite. So they found the ships, but they're still searching for where Franklin might be buried. And particularly as his ships are now being actively explored by Parks Canada, and there's still others out there looking for his gravesite, it's interesting to see what other mysteries will unfold. So I'll leave it at that. I'm going to pass it back to Rob, and it looks like we still have some time for questions. So thank you very much, guys.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. Now, before we jump into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's dive into some questions. Is there actually evidence that Scottish people may have arrived before the Vikings?
I personally haven't seen any evidence that the Scottish people arrived before the Vikings. That would be something interesting to dive into. The only early evidence I've seen is those letters that I was talking about that discuss kind of Basque fishermen, Portuguese fishermen reaching the coast of Newfoundland. I've also read evidence of early Inuit or early indigenous people from North America that were blown off route and actually ended up in Europe in open kayaks and things like that. But I can't speak to anything regarding Scottish reaching North America before the Vikings, but I very well could be mistaken.
Gotcha. Thank you. So, do you know what that hole in the rock was that was marked HH 1612? Do we know what that hole is?
Can I just skip back up to that image?
Sounds like a good idea.
That works. I believe the hole, yeah. So the rock was discovered while they were blasting and excavating for the highway. So the hole is a much more modern mark that would have been used for blasting ordinances to clear for the roadway, if that makes sense.
Yeah, gotcha. So, do we know why boats, when they get stuck in the ice, why don't they get crushed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a lot of thought went into that earlier in European exploration. A lot of the boats were actually designed that when they got stuck in the ice, they'd kind of be lifted up on top of the ice. A lot of the boats were actually incredibly well reinforced as well. So the Erebus and the Terror, the two bomb ships that were ultimately taken, were reinforced additionally for the ice. But there are stories of boats before that being crushed by the ice, boats that were stuck in the ice for the winter, and then as soon as that ice would break up, the vessel would sink as well. And then the ultimate fate of the Erebus is ironic because that boat was on the ice. It would have been reboarded, perhaps sailed, or perhaps just drifted south with the ice to its ultimate resting point. But when it was discovered, it was on top of the ice, according to the Inuit when they found it. But they couldn't figure out a way how to board the vessel, so they actually ended up cutting a hole in the side of the Erebus. And then when spring came, the Erebus sank to its current resting place now.
Gotcha. Thank you. So, has anything been recovered from the Franklin ships?
Definitely, just in the last couple of years. You can imagine it's incredibly difficult conditions. So some years Parks Canada is planning expeditions to go recover artifacts, and they have to scrap that whole expedition if the weather turns. You can also imagine, I've had friends up there that are diving with Parks Canada. You need to have polar bear guards while you're diving underwater. So it's a slow process. I might be jumbling up my numbers. I believe 135 artifacts were taken out of the Erebus just this past summer. So far, no written documents or things like that, but a lot of really, really interesting artifacts are being recovered from both ships. And they're also really trying to speed up that process. So you can, as the weather is changing up in the Arctic, these two spots where the Erebus and the Terror were are really shallow bodies of water. We're getting more and more storm surges. We're getting more and more waves moving through that area. And these artifacts are really at risk of deteriorating quite rapidly as the climate is warming up there. So work is happening quite quickly.
Gotcha. So, do we know what kind of canned food maybe they would have had on the Franklin?
I don't know exactly. It's a lot of canned vegetables, things like that. There was a lot of discussion at the time because the contract for the canned food was given out to the lowest bidder, and it's thought that lowest bidder had really improperly handled the food, like we discussed with the smoldering of the lead as well. So I don't know exactly the provisions that were within each tin of food, but it would have been carrots, peas, vegetables, things like that.
Gotcha. So, can trichinosis traces still be found in remains that are that old?
The evidence of trichinosis can't be found. So the theory of trichinosis is really a theory based on the symptoms that were described by Jens Monk, and then with regards to Franklin, it's really a theory that's just been put forward in the last couple of years to really try and explain that high discrepancy of early deaths in the expedition. But no, there's no actual physical evidence of the trichinosis in the bodies that have been exhumed.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that. Um, so, do we know when the artifacts from the Erebus are going to be made public for us to see?
Definitely, yeah. So a lot of them are public at the moment, but a lot of them are housed up in a community called Joe Haven. So Joe Haven is a community on the southern part of King William Island. It's actually where Roald Amundsen first overwintered. So his boat was known as the Joe. So Joe Haven is a beautiful little community up there. Now it's an Inuit community, and a lot of the research is being based right out of that community. It's only about 80 kilometers from both of the sites. So most of those artifacts are taken back and they're housed in an interpretive center up there in Joe Haven. So to see most of these artifacts, you actually have to travel up to Joe Haven, which you can do on a lot of these Northwest Passage cruises. They end up stopping at the community there.
So, are there any small vessel cruises through the Northwest Passage or even submersible trips?
I don't know of any fully submersible trips. I do know that there are some expeditions that travel with submersibles. I don't know company names off the top of my head, but I know Lindblad is offering a lot of small vessel trips up there as well. And there are trips like same as down happening in Antarctica. You can get on boats now with about 20 passengers, ranging all the way up into a couple hundred passengers. Those smaller vessels are really getting the opportunity to go to some of those places, to visit some of those communities that the bigger vessels don't get to. But there's more and more opportunity, and as the climate warms, as the Northwest Passage opens up, it's really this kind of idea of first chance tourism. It's getting the opportunity to go to these places that have really been inaccessible up until now.
Gotcha. So you mentioned polar bears, but were there seals and walruses, etc., up there? Could they have been eating uh, other meats besides the polar bears?
Definitely, and I think the reason that it's we focus on polar bears is because of the two because of the area that the two expeditions were. So in Churchill, we know there are a lot of polar bears at the time of year that Jens Monk had come through. So that's the reason that we're running our polar bear tours at time of year as well. In October and November, there's a lot of bears moving through the area, and that's a whole nother discussion on its own as to why. But we do know there are a lot of bears in that area. So they would have been taking advantage of other game. But by the time Jens Monk kind of established their overwintering area, a lot of that other animals would have left, right? So the birds had head south, the caribou would move south, the marine mammals had kind of moved out as well. So there's still polar bears that would have been moving through the area trying to get back onto the ice. And same with the John Franklin expedition. So they had all those tin can provisions, but they would have been supplementing that with game as well, with birds, with marine mammals. But the theory has really been put forward because we know that they were stuck in an area that was really, really low productivity. There wouldn't have been, it's out of the walrus range. There wouldn't have been big marine mammals moving through. There might have been seals here and there, but the ice was really thick. So the idea that Ken McCougan is talking about is perhaps that bears would have been the most abundant resource as they were moving through that area from one area to another. And as the boat was stuck there, they would have been able to pick off bears as they passed by.
So, what are these four markers that we see on our screen in front of us?
Great question. Yeah. So this is actually the site at Beechy Island. So you might recall I said 3 men died on John Franklin's expedition. So 3 of these graves are from that first 1845 John Franklin expedition. The 4th grave site is actually a subsequent man who died searching for that John Franklin expedition. So this has become one of those really well-known sites up in the Arctic. So if you do one of those cruises, or you're lucky enough to head up there, you'll stop often at Beechy Island, weather permitting, and you'll get a chance to see these grave sites. So these 3 of these graves would have been exhumed in the 1980s, and which is where that idea of lead poisoning really started to originate from.
Gotcha. So, is there any truth to the theory that a polar bear liver is toxic? And could that have been another thing that hurt them?
Definitely, there is truth to that theory. I know there's also a daily dose of nature talking specifically about vitamin A toxicity in the polar bear liver. So that could have been, and like we say, right, we're talking theories now, and we'll never know the actual truth. So that definitely could have been something that had gone on. So many different possibilities are there. But it was really known by indigenous groups, by Inuit, and by Europeans at the time, that the liver could be toxic. So in general, it was typically avoided, and just the meat was eaten.
Gotcha. Now back to these markers for a moment. Are these something new, or were these something that has been there for a long time? And if so, would they have brought them with them on the trip?
So these markers are not original to the expedition. They were put in place by subsequent expeditions to honor the men that had died there. The original burial would have been a cairn of a cairn of stones that was just marking the burial site of the men.
Gotcha. Good to know. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, Anthony, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you have for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's always a lot of fun for me able to talk about some of these stories from Churchill. And I really hope you guys found something interesting today or piqued a little bit of curiosity. And I really hope to see you up in Churchill for our Northern Lights or for our polar bear season.
Anthony, thank you so much for presenting this unique and fascinating topic for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. So if you are interested in information on how you could travel to the Arctic with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you could send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. And if you're part of a photo club and would like NatHab to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, email us at webinars@nathab.com. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.